you will start to see why he has some of the issues he has. His grandmother was accused of murdering his grandfather, but she was ultimately acquitted on that charge. Mom, not sure exactly what mom's deal is against men in general, but in the documentary, we'll see that she uses men to have kids, and that's it. There's not much of relationships involved there, ever. Michael, you coming back after Thanksgiving?
Yes, sir.
Kendra, you coming back?
I'm not sure.
Okay, I'll put you as a no. It's not a big deal. Are you coming back after Thanksgiving? So far, it looks like the majority of you will be here, so we'll probably have class that week of the 23rd. But as you can see, some juvenile crime, restorative justice just won't fix that, right? There's no sitting everyone down at the table and giving all the stakeholders a say in what happens. Just in that brief 5-minute video, you can see that Paris Bennett, he lacks the capacity to empathize with what he did. And if someone wants to use this case for their paper, feel free to, right? I prefer you not all do it. I want you to actually go out and research other cases. But in the family code, we discussed that moment of when a child asks for his parents versus the parents asking to be with the child. This is a prime example of how that played out. In the old police department, our unit wasn't separated from everyone else. And has anyone ever been on the second floor of the old police department? No? So as you walked into the secretaries that sat in CID, there's a wall to your left. That wall wasn't there the night he killed his sister. Obviously, police officers responded, the youth division responded. They took him into custody, took him up to the police department, and began the magistration process. Meanwhile, mom responds to the house. She was at work. There was a babysitter at the house. She responds to the house, finds out that her daughter is dead, and she wants to get to her son. Speaking with the officers, she did not want to be with her son in a protective measure. She wanted to kill her son. So once she got to the police department, there was a point where they physically restrained her to prevent her from getting to her son. And all this was brought up in court in determining whether his confession was voluntary or not. And ultimately, the appeals court ruled that he never asked for his mom to be present. He never requested that. Therefore, we did not have to allow her to be present and interfere with the investigation. So it ultimately worked out in favor of the police department, but it's a good example of why parents that try to invoke their rights to their kids, they can't do that. Now, I also caution you on that if you become a police officer. A 10-year-old, if I'm talking to a 10-year-old, I don't assume that he understands what's going on the way a 14, 15, 16-year-old might. And so in that case, if a parent says, don't talk to my kid without an attorney, I'm going to oblige them. If I'm talking to a 16-year-old, mom says, don't talk to him unless the attorney's present. If he doesn't ask for an attorney, I've explained it to him. He can talk to me if he wants to. Right? So that's a good case to kind of look into. Over the last couple of weeks, we've seen several attempts on the state level to institute restorative type justice through the family code. For instance, 54.0401 talks about community-based programs, right? Ultimately what we're talking about. And under this section of the Family Code, the community-based programs are available for serious criminal conduct, but there's a caveat there. The state will only pay for those in counties with more than 335,000 people. So you're talking about your metropolitan areas: Dallas, Austin, Houston, San Antonio. All right? Abilene, Taylor County doesn't meet that, so the state funding isn't available for those types of community-based programs. Also, we've seen programs specifically geared for individuals who are caught up in delinquent conduct, but are also victims of child sex trafficking or trafficking in general. It could be even labor trafficking. And it talks about if the judge orders them to attend a program and they successfully complete that program, they can be required to report to the judge periodically. And then once they turn 18, those records get sealed beyond what juvenile records typically get sealed. So what challenges do you see when considering victims of trafficking? Say I've got a young girl. She's 16 years old. She's caught up in sex trafficking. But in the meantime, she's also committed some criminal behavior. So I take her into custody. For instance, the last one I had, she stole her mom's debit card and used it to buy a bunch of stuff. So that's a state jail felony. So I've got her out at JDC. She's hooked in on a state jail felony, debit card abuse. And the judge orders her to go to a program. What challenges can be presented there? Typically, when you're talking about child sex trafficking, it's not the I'm going to kidnap you and force you, drug you, leave you in a room, and people are going to come in and have their way. All right. For the lack of better terms, there is a level of complicity in that. And so a victim of child sex trafficking typically does not view themselves as a victim. And so the challenge is presented on the forefront is, how do I prove that this young person is a victim of child sex trafficking? Unless I have video evidence or something of that sort that's beyond questionable, how do I convince the judge that yes, this child has committed delinquent conduct, but here's some circumstances that I think we should take into consideration and divert from a criminal type program, maybe long-term confinement or post-adjudication confinement, but push them to a rehabilitation center, somewhere where they can receive counseling, somewhere where they can get help that they need. Most victims of sex trafficking don't want to readily admit that. Right? So that's a challenge up front. Second, you've got jurisdictional issues. Right? Most of the time, sex trafficking isn't taking place in Abilene. It's being moved to one of the larger cities, and rather quickly. And so, for me, I'm very passionate about this topic, and I will go anywhere, anytime, and work as long as I have to bring that child home. The issue is, who's going to pay me to do that? Right? My bosses say, no, it's not happening. You're not going to Dallas-Fort Worth to find this girl. Call someone up there. Well, case in point, just last week, we had one of these. I called Arlington PD. They said, yeah, we'll get right on that. I haven't heard a thing since. I'm texting updates, not getting anything back. They have bigger fish to fry in bigger cities. So these jurisdictional issues come into play. The key is convincing my bosses just to let me go once, and then my phone dies and they don't get an update till I get home. And then if they pay me, good. If they don't, they don't. But I got to get that permission to go in the on the forefront. And then finally, evidence. So the first case I worked of sex trafficking, I was able to convince my bosses to let me go. We're heading up to Dallas-Fort Worth, and I look at my partner. I said, "You realize we're not going home till we got her?" He says, "Yep." And so we end up finding her on the side of I-35 at a motel. And we start questioning her. She doesn't want to cooperate, right? She doesn't want to tell us who she was with. So we start tracking some geolocations, and we find out some guys that she was with, and they deny even knowing her. So the evidence is slim. Unfortunately for her, she had picked up some evidence that she was unaware of, and when the individuals were presented with this evidence, they were ready to tell us their part in it. So we were able to get some confessions to corroborate some digital evidence that we had. In addition, we see community programs such as the electronic transmission of certain visual material depicting a minor educational programs. So this is a relatively new law, visual material depicting a minor, and what it has to do with is sexting and exchanging of nude photos between juveniles. If you think back, before every 10-year-old had an iPhone 12, this wasn't an issue. So there was no law on the books to address a kid who doesn't quite understand the consequences of their action sending child pornography electronically, which is both a federal and a state law, minimum second-degree felony. And so we've got these teenagers at school sending their bathroom pictures, and cops arresting them for second-degree felony manufacturing of child pornography. Legislators saw an issue with that. They also understood that the judgment of juveniles are not entirely developed, so they bumped that down to a Class A misdemeanor. And it became even more prevalent to where it was boyfriend and girlfriend sending photos back and forth, but then they would break up and those photos would leak in the locker room or across Snapchat or Instagram. And so they knocked it down to a Class C misdemeanor, basically a speeding ticket, right? Well, those cases can be referred back to the school for educational purposes. This morning I was preparing for class and I had a meeting at the department, so I was already there, and I'm reading over this and my bosses weren't doing anything. So I said, "Hey, does AISD have this program?" They're like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "Well, the family code says refer to the education code," which it's one of those awesome secret education codes that they don't think we need to read. So I had to Google it, and come to find out the state funds school districts to develop these programs. And so they're like, "Well, we'll find out the answer." So now they're trying to figure out what's going on with these cases that we send as ticketable offenses to JDC, and whether or not those kids are actually receiving services. My guess is they're not, and if they are, it's very like student code of conduct. This is what we expect of you, and that's the end of it. But ultimately, this course is designed to provide education, to understand the dangers of sending things electronically that shouldn't be out there, and also the dangers of once you send it, there's no getting it back. It can be replicated, it can be sold, it can be saved. And there's several other programs which address things like graffiti and minor theft. However, while there's various community-based programs to address juvenile delinquencies, the issue that arises is multifaceted. Who's going to administer those programs? Who's going to fund such programs? And who's responsible for oversight of those programs? Right? If you didn't get anything out of our book this semester, I hope that through a critical lens, you can see that this is an excellent idea on paper, but whenever you start trying to put it into practice, there's difficulties, right? Much like there's layers of the justice system, this requires multifaceted layers. Most of which, what's already in place is overwhelmed and underfunded and understaffed. And so our goal as professionals in the system, and your goal as future professionals, is to try to find a piece that you can put in play wherever you're at and grow upon what's already there. 2 weeks ago, I was in a missing person class, and one thing they hammered in is basically child kidnapping. Is 99% of the time in child kidnapping, the evidence is already there. You just have to find the dots and connect them. Right? Within an hour of being called to a kidnapping, all the information that you gather, 99% of the time, the evidence is already there. You just have to figure out how to connect those dots and find that child. And it's the same with this. We have the infrastructure. We have the ideas. We just have to learn how to put them into place and ensure that they're working. When talking about the more traditional sense, you guys read the family code last week, I believe, about progressive sanctions. You guys remember progressive sanctions? What are your thoughts on progressive sanctions? So the state of Texas works off of a model called the progressive sanction model for how they adjudicate juvenile delinquency. This goes against the majority of Audtroon's theory that the majority of juveniles are locked up for minor drug offenses and minor property crimes, right? In Texas, by law, by the family code, that just debunks that whole argument. Now, that's not to say across the board it's like that, but in Texas, that debunks the entire argument. Because for those minor crimes, you can only get like sanction level 1 or 2, which if you read are typically deferred adjudication type crimes. Now, the way deferred adjudication works is I refer the case to JDC. The attorney offers them, hey, deferred adjudication. If you complete this program, this doesn't go to the court, doesn't appear like it's adjudication on your record. And it's typically from 3 to 6 months. So you're talking about your Class B and Class A misdemeanor offenses, with the exception of anything that involves a handgun, right? So they routinely meet with their probation officer. They may have to take a drug screening every now and then, but if they complete this program, the case goes away. Well, the question is, what happens if they commit another offense? Well, by the progressive level sanction, they actually have to commit 2 more offenses. One has to be higher, and the other one can be 1 degree lower before that progression takes place to the next sanction level. Right? So if you start with, say, graffiti, and you end up with progression sanction level 1 probation, you come back and you complete, you violate the law at the grade of Class A misdemeanor, you might go to progression level sanction 2, or you might get progression sanction level 1. Right? Now this goes up based on your offenses, but what you'll see is it isn't until you get to progression level 5 or 6 that there's somewhat a mandatory confinement. Progression level 4, you could get sent to a post-adjudication facility for 6 months to a year, but 5, 6, and 7 are the ones where you're getting sent to the Texas Department of Juvenile Justice, right? And so, what's the issues there? Several years ago, we had a young man kill another individual because he wouldn't purchase alcohol for him. Right? And so, doing a social autopsy on this individual, it was found that he had actually committed 18 separate misdemeanors, 16 of which he had been adjudicated for and placed on probation before he committed this murder. And so with progressive sanctions, there's restrictions on how we can confine kids. All his misdemeanors never equated to him being confined for more than a few weeks at a time locally. He had been sent to one drug treatment facility for 3 months. I don't know how many millions of dollars were spent on this one individual, and all his time in JDC and all the investigations by the police, with the attorneys, with the programs that were given to him. But the point of this, the point of this is the fact that the progressive model is broken when dealing with these repeat offenders when it comes to misdemeanors, because by law we can't just send them off to TJJD. So considering trauma-informed care and a little bit of discussion on your papers. Has anyone started their paper yet? I didn't think so. That's okay. So in the final chapter, you looked at various things that go into trauma-informed care. One of the primary issues is with the victim. What challenges have been presented on the victim side of crime? Anyone ever been a victim of a crime? We kind of talked about the blaming aspect of it, right? A lot of times when you're dealing with crime, and this is where you have to be sensitive in law enforcement, is blaming the victim, right? Young girl goes to a party, she's drinking willingly, she starts making out with a guy, and then she gets raped, right? They're gonna feel responsible because their actions led up to that, right? Well, they have no guilt in that crime. We have to understand that on the law enforcement side, and we have to be cognizant of that whenever we're interviewing these victims, right? It's not against the law to have fun. It is against the law to rape somebody, right? You have to draw that line. And so victim blaming is big, and victims often see their cases go before the court where they're re-victimized. What am I talking about when I say re-victimized? If you've been involved in any kind of traumatic event in your life, every time you tell that story, it cuts a little deeper. It hurts. Now I imagine a 15, 16, even 21-year-old young lady having to stand on a stand and graphically describe what happened to her in these cases. And then let's throw a defense attorney in there who all he cares about is the paycheck, and he doesn't mind calling her a liar. He doesn't mind blaming her. And so the victims ultimately get re-victimized throughout the court process. Now, when you start talking about younger kids, there are things such as the forensic interview process that are in place to help with that. If I have a 6, 7, 8-year-old and she's been sexually assaulted, she'll take a forensic interview. It's conducted by a forensic interview specialist, not by law enforcement. It's all open-ended questions. And that DVD can be that child's testimony. There's no cross-examination on that. It keeps this 8, 9, 10-year-old from having to testify in such a scary situation. Oftentimes survivors are doubting. Did this really happen? There's no witnesses. It's just your word versus his word. Most of the time they feel like they've lost control of their lives. On the criminal justice side of things, information is sometimes hard to share with victims. Right? If I'm investigating a homicide, there's some information I have to keep close until it comes out in court. The reason for that is, one, to safeguard evidence. If the public knows all of our evidence, then that evidence can be manipulated when it's brought to trial. Oftentimes in cold cases, there's one or two facts that are never publicly admitted to in a case. This is even more so for kidnappings. That way, when we do have a suspect and we are interviewing that suspect, if they know that one piece of information, it corroborates their guilt. But a lot of times in kidnapping situations and things like that, you'll have tons of people come forward and confess to that crime. Why? I don't know. Some of you psychological majors can explain that to me, but you'll have people in prison confessing to those crimes over the years. And they'll tell you every detail they heard on TV, but they won't know that one critical detail. So sometimes sharing information with victims, they kind of feel like they're left in the dark. When it comes to resources, victims often feel like they're left out. And we put a lot of effort. This entire class is based on restorative justice, primarily how to address juvenile delinquency. And if we put all these resources into the suspect, what resources are we putting into the victim? So that's where programs like the Regional Crime Victims Advocacy Program comes in alongside us, and they walk along with that victim from start to finish. And all of my sexual assaults, if we go up to the hospital, an advocate comes with that child, and that advocate will come to every appointment, every court hearing, everything with that child throughout the process. And that's the same with adults. We can refer them to the crime victims as well. And compassion. At the end of the day, victims, we have to show them compassion. Regardless of the circumstances, they've been victimized, and they deserve compassion from all levels of the justice system. Right? I think, in my professional opinion, if we bring victims in and if they have stake in this case, if they're invested in this case, then they'll have the feeling that they need to see it through. And so that, as an investigator, whether you're with the police department or CPS or any number of other programs that you may find yourself in this line of work, if we are helping the victims along, they're going to be more invested in seeing justice in the final end than if we just leave them in the dark, if we cast doubt on their stories, if we blame them for what happened. Right? We all want to be on the same page. So that's the important aspect of incorporating that victim services in restorative justice. Any questions thus far as it comes to the end of this book? If I teach this next fall, I probably will not use this book unless one of you guys give me a good reason to use it. I think parts of it was beneficial, parts of it not so much. That's just me, but I'm not an expert in those things. So, as you develop your restorative justice plan in your paper, weigh the pros and the cons. Okay? How is this going to work, and where are the challenges presented in the program that you're applying to the case? Right? This is where your critical thinking all comes together. Use the resources that we've gone over this semester, and also find some new resources. You guys have an excellent library system that I continue to use. Utilize it. Read some papers on that. Find out what's working and what's not working. Does anyone have questions over that final paper? So I believe 11/15, the rest of the semester is gonna open up for you. That means the last 3 weeks of school, you can get ahead if you'd like. That final week, everything is due on Wednesday, I believe. That means you got a final exam, open book, primarily off the family code, a few questions out of this. And you can get ahead on that over Thanksgiving break. And I don't care if you come back after Thanksgiving, that's completely up to you. If it looks like the rest of the school is gonna actually meet, we'll hold class. If not, I will let everyone know via Canvas. Any questions? Does anyone want extra credit? Okay. Have a wonderful day.